Australia's housing crisis is everywhere, all throughout our news headlines. Rents are skyrocketing, homeownership is out of reach for many, and homelessness is on the rise. But what if I told you that these problems aren't just about supply and demand? What if they're symptoms of something much deeper? A system that has been shaped by decades of policies, economic incentives, and social challenges. The housing crisis isn't a single issue, it's a symptom. And to understand it, we need to begin to think in systems. My goal in making this deep dive video is to show just how complex something like the Australian housing crisis is, to show that there are many different forces and factors that are at play, and because there is no single cause of the housing crisis, there is no single solution. Think of Australia's housing market as a giant interconnected system with stocks and flows, a bit like a bathtub. Housing supply flows in through construction, but demand constantly pulls out through population growth, investment trends, and migration. I think most of us understand intuitively that the housing crisis is a supply and demand problem, but I think the way that a lot of people conceptualize supply and demand is a little bit too simplified and doesn't accurately reflect the complexity of stocks and flows in a system. And I've seen this with a lot of discourse, particularly about this idea that we're letting too many immigrants into the country and that is why there are not enough houses, when it's a little bit more complex than just the absolute number of people in the country and the absolute number of houses in the country. So we can think of this in systems thinking terms as stocks and flows. So we're going to use this bathtub analogy to conceptualize the flow of stocks, which in this case is houses, and how that is affected by different aspects of the housing crisis. So using this bathtub analogy, we could think of this here, the stock in the bathtub, as being the total available housing. And this number is going to fluctuate anywhere between the maximum that the system can hold and the minimum. So sometimes the water level might be here, other times it might be here. A lot of the time that is going to be relative depending on the context or the person that we're thinking about this through the lens of. So our stock is made up of the total number of available homes, whether that's for ownership or rental. And if more homes are added than there are removed, housing stock is going to increase and the stock is going to decrease if the outflows exceed the inflows. The stock of houses includes any existing homes, it includes any newly built homes or homes that are being demolished, removed, or left vacant for investment or speculation. So the inflows are the amount of houses that are going into our total stock of available housing. So this can include anything from new housing constructions, any government and affordable social housing, or public housing projects. It includes any repurposed buildings. This could be anything from switching a building from commercial to residential, or adding something like a granny flat to an existing property. And it also includes investor-owned properties that are entering the market. So investor-owned properties affect the rental stock, but they're not going to affect the total housing supply. However, we have all of this potential inflows for housing supply, but we have bottlenecks. There are things at this point that are affecting the number of these houses from the housing supply that can actually flow into our total available housing. So this could include anything from high construction costs to labour shortages, planning regulations, slow approval processes, anything that is going to reduce the rate of inflow and limit the total number of available homes. Then we have the outflows. The outflows include any houses that are lost or any reduced access. So the outflow of our stock can drain in a number of ways. First of all, we could have demolitions or any kind of like urban renewal projects. So as older homes are being knocked down, if they're not being replaced as quickly, then that's going to lead to outflow and the stock levels are going to decrease if they're not replaced as quickly. This could be anything from investment properties that are left vacant. So these homes remain in the system, but they're not actually available for occupancy. So they contribute to the outflow of the total available stock. there are affordability barriers. So I mentioned that sometimes the level of stock is going to be contextual or subjective depending on what group of people or what individual we're looking at this in the context of. So if there are affordability barriers, if the prices or the rents are rising too fast, that's effectively going to remove homes from the accessible stock that is available to that person. And then of course we have other things like short-term rentals. So the increase of Airbnbs, where we're shifting from these long-term rental stock to having these properties being used more so for short-term rentals or tourism accommodation. So that contributes to the outflows. So when we have inflows that are too slow and outflows that are too fast, we drain the total amount of housing available. We drain the stock. If the stock reaches the minimum, it means we don't have houses for everyone. So how do stocks and flows explain key aspects of the rental crisis right now? Well, first of all, we have housing shortages. So that is a low net flow rate. So the inflows, new builds, are not keeping pace with the outflows in the system. So demolitions, vacancies, or these affordability barriers. And so the housing stock is not growing fast enough to meet the demand. So if we were to create a solution to address this, our interventions might have to target anything that increases inflows. So we would need to be looking at things like faster housing approvals, construction incentives, while reducing the outflows. So we would also have to address vacancy taxes, restrictions on speculative investment, anything that's going to not only increase our inflows, but reduce our outflows. We have to have interventions that target both of these. We could look at something like delays and other bottlenecks in construction. So that's creating a lag time between the inflow and the stock growth. So we have these inflow processes, so things like construction, that often have delays. And even if the demand surges today, the increasing supply is going to actually take a longer period of time. It's going to take years for all of the planning approvals, any labor shortages, any material costs to actually catch up to that demand. So policy implications here, we're going to have to address supply bottlenecks by streamlining approval processes, improving workforce capacity, and stabilizing material costs. If we were to look at the rising prices and affordability as being a constraint on stock availability, even if the housing stock is growing, it doesn't mean affordability is improving. So if the house prices are rising too fast, many homes are essentially just going to evaporate for some people from our accessible stock because potential buyers or renters are simply being priced out of the market. So policy implications here means we need to introduce measures that are going to support home buyers, that are going to put rental caps on or increase the amount of social housing to ensure that we have stock levels that remain fully functional and accessible to everyone. The housing crisis is more than just an issue of supply and demand in terms of the number of available homes and the number of people that we have. It's actually a lot more complex. There are a lot more processes at play that are contributing to what we see in the media. So think about this next time you see somebody who is trying to simplify stocks and flows in terms of the supply and demand of housing in Australia.
When we begin to map out the system through different system dynamics, we can begin to notice patterns that occur over time, and these are called system archetypes. These are common structures that keep problems stuck in place. Let's look at 4 common archetypes that are shaping Australia's housing crisis.
Welcome to part 1 of understanding the Australian housing crisis so you don't end up perpetuating misinformation online. Today we are looking at limits to growth, also known as why immigrants aren't to blame for supply and demand, and it's actually more bureaucratic red tape and infrastructure problems that we need to address. So the limits to growth archetype is one that we can visualize as a reinforcing and 2 balancing feedback loops, showing the initial growth and why the initial growth is eventually slowed by limiting factors. So we have our main variable that we're concerned with here, which is population growth. Now, population growth largely increased just after COVID restrictions lifted. So if we're thinking about population growth, what initially happened when we had population growth, particularly in capital cities? We saw an increase in economic growth. This increase in economic growth then led to an increase in investment in housing, which led to an increase in housing supply, and that in turn contributed to the increase in population growth. So we had this reinforcing feedback loop. A reinforcing feedback loop is one where change is being accelerated in one direction. So we're either seeing a massive increase or a massive decrease. However, it begins to slow down because there are limiting factors at play in the system. So here we also had, after there was a time delay, population growth then led to housing demand increasing. But because there were eventually land and zoning restrictions, we actually saw a decrease in supply because this affected the total stock, the total available amount of housing, because of the bottlenecks at the inflow. This then led to a decrease in supply, a decrease in affordability, a change in the same direction. And so here we have a balancing feedback loop. So this is one that actually counteracts population growth. Then we have another balancing loop at play. So we could think of the fact that there was population growth, which after a time delay also led to pressure on our transport systems and other essential services. This actually led to a strain on infrastructure, which further limited zoning and planning restrictions, and that in turn led to an increase in housing supply. So we have this other balancing feedback loop. So this is why there is relative stability in terms of the total available number of housing. So initially, population growth stimulates economic expansion and investment in housing, and we see this with this reinforcing feedback loop. However, there are limits due to things like land scarcity, planning restrictions, and infrastructure bottlenecks. So even if there are policy incentives for more housing construction, urban density constraints, so things like zoning laws, transport capacity, it's going to slow down the supply, and it's going to cause persistent shortages and affordability issues. So our leverage points in the system, the things where we're going to have the most impact, is addressing things like reforming restrictive zoning laws, improving transport and infrastructure due to the expanded housing beyond major city centres, and streamlining planning and approval processes. Welcome to part 2 of understanding the Australian housing crisis so that you don't spread misinformation or begin to reduce a complex problem to really simplistic thinking. This is the success to the successful system archetype. It's sometimes known as the self-fulfilling prophecy, or as I like to call it, why the rich get richer, the poor stay poor, and you can't just work harder to change the system. So here we are dealing with two main groups of people. We have Group A, in this case, Group A are going to be wealthy individuals and property investors, and then we have Group B. Group B are going to be our first home buyers or people who are lower income renters, and when I say lower income, I mean in comparison to that wealthy group. So we have our wealthy individuals and property investors who are going to benefit from rising housing prices, and they're going to use their assets to acquire more properties, whereas first home buyers and lower income rentals are going to struggle to compete, leading to increased inequality. This is a really great archetype in general for just conceptualizing how our capitalist economy works. So we have our first reinforcing loop, which is for Group A, our wealthy individuals and property investors. So it's very simple. Investors purchase properties. As they purchase properties, there is an increased demand for rentals, and as they are able to use these properties as rentals, they get rental income and capital gains. Their wealth and borrowing power increases, and they are able to buy or invest in more properties. So this is a reinforcing feedback loop. It is accelerating change in one direction. In this context, we are accelerating the wealth of Group A. So in terms of Group B, this increases housing demand because people need homes. This leads to an increase in property prices. Then we have barriers that actually prevent people from entering the housing market. And then that enables more investors to purchase properties because there are barriers for other people to enter the property market. That is a reinforcing feedback loop, and that is perpetuating inequality. We also have a balancing feedback loop at play, and it's this balancing feedback loop that is preventing this group from becoming part of this group. Our balancing feedback loop begins with our rental prices increasing after investors are purchasing properties. So
investors are purchasing properties, and that's leading to an increase in rental prices. That leads to a decrease in Group B's ability to save for a deposit, which makes the transition to home ownership. And that just means that investors keep purchasing the properties. So we have a balancing feedback loop here. So our first reinforcing feedback loop is the investor advantage. Our second reinforcing feedback loop is the first home buyer disadvantage, and our balancing loop is the rental affordability crisis. There's higher rents, it's harder to save, and more dependence on rentals. Here we have entrenching housing inequality, and here we have wealth begetting wealth. So in order to identify leverage points in our success to the successful archetype and dynamics of the system, first of all, we need to have policy adjustments that are going to reduce incentives like negative gearing, capital gains, tax concessions that are disproportionately benefiting the investors in Group A. We need to also have more affordable housing initiatives, so we need to boost government-backed home loans or shared equity schemes that are going to help first home buyers to compete with the market. We need rental market reforms that are going to strengthen the protection for tenants and prevent exploitative rental hikes. And we need a general increase of housing supply to encourage a shift from housing as an asset class, from a speculative investment, to housing as a fundamental right or a need that is being addressed. The important thing to note here is that we need to have interventions that are addressing both of these groups or both of these reinforcing feedback loops. We can't just have interventions that are going to try and help Group B, so these first home buyers or lower income renters, to get into the housing market. We also have to address this reinforcing feedback loop, which means we need to have interventions that are going to stop incentivizing wealthy individuals to invest in property through speculative investments. We have to address both of these feedback loops. If you liked this video, my name is Tiana. I am a social impact strategist, and I almost have my PhD in communication for social change. I teach grassroots change makers how to think in systems and apply systems thinking to their own work. And I have a completely free training with my organization, the School of Social Impact, where you can learn all about systems thinking. Welcome to part 3 of understanding the Australian housing crisis so that we don't further spread misinformation or simplify complex problems. This is a really easy one to wrap your head around, I think. This is the fixes that fail archetype, and we see a whole bunch of these dynamics in the current system that we're concerned with, the Australian housing market. I sometimes like to think of these as band-aid solutions or even shiny objects. They're things that distract us from the real underlying problem. We could also think of this as don't think that politicians and any of their initiatives are actually about helping people and not about their own wealth and agendas archetype. So really simple. We have a balancing feedback loop, which is the one that we get distracted by. This is the shiny object. So we have housing affordability increasing. So the government increases housing subsidies. And as this one increases, the other one decreases. So we have a nice balancing feedback loop. However, as the housing market becomes more affordable, for a very short period of time, we're going to see this artificial inflation of the housing market. The price of houses, the value of houses is suddenly going to go up, and that is going to act as a reinforcing loop. Those subsidies lead to market inflation, and that market inflation is going to make houses less affordable. So here we have a reinforcing feedback loop, and this is essentially going to cancel out the balancing. So this balancing loop is going to make the system seem a little bit stable for a while, but then eventually this reinforcing feedback loop is going to say, oh, actually, nope. So if this is change over time, you can see what that looks like. Very simple one to wrap your head around, I think. Welcome to part 4 of understanding the Australian housing crisis so that you don't spread misinformation or simplify a very complex problem. This is the shifting the burden archetype. This explains a lot of the dynamics that we see in the Australian housing crisis. And I also like to think of this one as why the government needs to pull its finger out, because private investment alone is not sustainable to solve this problem. Now here we have our symptom or our problem that we're concerned with, and that is housing supply, particularly shortages. Then we have our symptomatic solution, so the solution that the government is prioritizing. That has a time delay, but then it leads to a particular side effect.
And then that further delays what the fundamental solution actually is. So here, our fundamental solution is obviously going to be government investment in affordable housing. Our problem, our symptomatic problem, is that there is a low supply of housing. So the symptomatic solution is that the government is prioritizing private development to solve this problem, which increases the private sector supply of housing and everything that's happening with the private sector. So this is a balancing feedback loop. So this one's going to lead to relative stability. It's not going to lead to too much change. But then we have a side effect. After there is a time delay, we actually get reduced effectiveness. So this could be anything from increase in material costs. There's more bureaucratic red tape that builders have to go through in order to get zoning approvals and all that kind of stuff. And then this leads to a further delay where eventually we actually see that this one never happens. So we have shortages of housing, we have private sector development. We're not seeing enough of this happening. And so we're avoiding the fundamental solution. And so that's a balancing feedback loop. So we've got this relative stability here, and then we're accelerating change here. So what this leads is essentially the system is always going to have little incentive for the fundamental solution, which is government investment in public or affordable housing. So shifting the burden means that the government is going to be relying on the private sector for development to try and resolve housing shortages. But all of these things like rising construction costs and market inflation, all of those things that come with that, is going to make these private developments less viable in order to address those root causes of the problem. And this is going to create a cycle where the crisis is only worsening while these long-term solutions remain unaddressed. So our biggest leverage point in shifting the burden is, surprise, surprise, not shifting the burden. So actually reducing dependencies on the private sector, expanding public housing programs instead of only incentivizing public solutions, addressing those systemic barriers, so lowering construction costs through subsidies, land reforms, or any kind of streamlining of approval processes, and obviously strengthening government regulation is going to help here too, to prevent the reliance on these short-term fixes by implementing more longer-term affordability strategies.
To solve a problem, we need to identify its root causes, not just treat the symptoms. By applying systems thinking, we can find leverage points where we're going to be able to create the most meaningful change in the system.
Now that we've had a look at some of the system dynamics that are at play in the Australian housing crisis, we can use the Iceberg Model to help us to visualize some of the different levels of understanding, moving away from focusing on those visible symptoms at the tip of the iceberg to considering some of the underlying structures and mental models that are actually perpetuating the crisis and holding it in place. So we have our visible symptoms, the events, which are the tip of the iceberg. These are the things above the waterline that we kind of observe in our day-to-day life. And these are the things that will typically generate news headlines, but we have to remember these are merely the tip of the iceberg. So these can include things like high home prices that we're seeing, rising rents and rental shortages. There's a lot longer waiting lists for public housing. There is obviously a big decline in home ownership throughout the population. And we're also seeing an increase in homelessness and housing stress. So if we go just below the waterline and begin to look at some of the patterns and trends that we might see if we're looking at housing issues over time, these reveal some persistent structural problems and patterns. So one of them is that property prices have consistently risen a lot faster than wages have. We have things like rental affordability worsening, particularly in capital cities. We see investment-driven housing outpacing first home. We see that governments are really relying on these short-term fixes rather than any kind of meaningful structural reform. We're also seeing construction cycles really beginning to lag behind demand, and this leads to supply shortages. Once we can recognize these patterns, this is going to help us to see that the housing crisis isn't just an isolated event with single solutions. but it is the result of these ongoing systemic trends. If we go a little bit deeper and we begin to look at these structures, these are kind of the driving forces behind the patterns and trends. So we have things like the financialization of housing. We're seeing housing being increasingly treated as an investment asset rather than a fundamental right, with policies like negative gearing and capital gains concessions that favor investors over home buyers. We're obviously seeing a lot of supply constraints, so planning regulations, slow approval processes, and infrastructure are really becoming bottlenecks that limit housing supply. We're seeing obviously a lot of tax policies that favor speculation. So investors benefit from tax incentives, and then this creates more incentivization to hold on to their property rather than to build affordable homes. We're seeing labor and infrastructure or material shortages. So there's rising construction costs and workforce shortages, which are delaying housing developments. And we are also seeing monetary policy impacts, so high interest rates that reduce both property investment and new housing construction, which restricts the overall supply. So these systemic structures begin to kind of explain why housing affordability problems are persisting despite any government intervention. Finally, we move down to the deepest level of our iceberg, the mental models. These are the assumptions, the cultural norms, the attitudes, the ideologies that people hold that shape all of the policies and economic behaviors at the systemic level. So we have a lot of dominant mental models that really influence Australia's housing system. So we see things like this idea that property is the best investment, which really encourages speculative buying, and it prioritizes wealth accumulation over housing accessibility. We have this mindset that housing supply alone is going to fix affordability. You know, if we just create more supply, then that alone is going to solve the problem. But we know that overlooks demand issues such as tax incentives and things that encourage speculation. There's this idea that home ownership is an individual achievement, not a social issue. So this frames housing as being an individual responsibility rather than something that demands collective action and policy change. And we also see this mindset that migration is causing the housing crisis, which obviously oversimplifies the issue and ignores that there are all of these structural supply constraints at play and that have been at play since we introduced negative gearing and capital gains tax incentives way back in the day. So changing the mental models is actually the key to achieving the most transformative change rather than just short-term fixes. Our mental models are always going to be the biggest leverage point. The deeper we go on the iceberg model means that we're going to get more leverage. So interventions that address these things are going to have a lot more leverage than things that just address these individual symptoms or events. So the iceberg model really helps us to explain how the visible housing issues that we see are actually rooted in much deeper systemic structures and mental models. And this reveals why a lot of our short-term so-called solutions tend to fail. We are using the problem tree, which is a useful tool to break down the housing crisis into the causes of the problem, so the root causes, which are represented here by the roots, the core problem, which is the trunk, and then the symptoms or the consequences, which are the leaves and the branches. So our central problem at the core of the problem tree is housing affordability and supply shortages. So this is obviously leading to things like rising homelessness, financial stress, and reduced home ownership rates. So the root causes of these, we kind of break down these underlying drivers of the crisis into economic and policy factors. So tax incentives like negative gearing, capital gains tax discounts, things that drive investment speculation, high interest rates that deter property investment and construction, or underinvestment in social housing. Then we have our supply constraints. So these are things like slow planning and approval processes, construction delays due to labor shortages or material shortages, and any infrastructure bottlenecks, so a lack of transport, services, or anything near housing developments. We also have things like market and financialization factors. So the fact that housing is being treated as an asset rather than a social good. We have short short-term rentals, things like Airbnb that are reducing the long-term rental supply, and also foreign and domestic investors that are purchasing multiple properties. Then we have our demographic and social factors. So these are things like population growth and also immigration rates that increase demand, things like wage growth not keeping up with housing price inflation. So all of these things are the root causes of the housing crisis. There's no single cause of the problem, which means there is going to be no single solution. The consequences or the symptoms of the problem are the social, economic, and political impacts that we see. So our social impacts include things like the increased risk of homelessness or housing insecurity, rising mental health issues due to financial stress, and a lot of young Australians being locked out of home. In terms of our economic factors, we have things like the rising cost of living pressures, reduced workforce mobility. People simply cannot afford to live where good jobs are, and a lot more government spending required on things like rental assistance and social housing. Then we have our political and policy impacts. So there is a lot of public pressure for rental caps and affordability measures. There are governments proposing these short-term policy fixes instead of systemic reforms, and a lot of increased debate surrounding things like migration and housing demand. So this is our housing crisis mapped out in terms of the symptoms or consequences of the problem, what the core problem is, and those root causes. So obviously our interventions need to address these root causes in order to create change and affect these things that we're seeing. We can't just address the symptoms, we have to address the root causes.
Australia's housing crisis isn't inevitable. It's a system, and systems can change, but systems take a long time to change. They require multiple different solutions that address all of the complexities and nuances of the system. I'm hoping that after watching this video, you have a much deeper understanding of the different dynamics that are at play in something as complex as Australia's housing crisis, and when you see the media, people online, or politicians trying to simplify such a complex problem by suggesting that there are single solutions that can address it, you will know a little bit better.
So we've looked at all of the system dynamics that are at play in terms of Australia's housing crisis. We've looked at the context surrounding the Australian housing crisis using the Iceberg Model. We've used the problem tree to begin to identify the root causes from the symptoms of the problem. What are some interventions or things that we could do to actually start to address those root causes of the problem? Well, here we are going to turn to our signature social change framework. So we're shifting a little bit from systems thinking now to just thinking more generally in terms of social change making. So if this framework is of interest to you, I wrote all about it in this handbook, The Changemaker in You. You can get a PDF copy of this book as well as a free video training and a copy of a worksheet to fill out as part of our Beginner Changemaking Essentials bundle at the School of Social Impact, completely free. So this is where we begin to think about the types of changes we would need to see in terms of individual and collective changes, so changes that affect people or groups or the things that people and groups need to access in a society, and the kind of social system itself, so the systemic aspects of the society. And then we also break it down further into informal changes. So these are less tangible, harder to kind of measure or tangibly track and assess, and formal changes, which are those changes that are a little bit easier to quantify and understand. So first, we need to look at what the specific changes we would like to see would be, and then we can look at some mechanisms that we would implement in order to actually bring about those changes. So our informal individual collective change is changes in people's knowledge of and commitment to the issue of the housing crisis, thus beginning to influence social norms. So here we would need to see an awareness and support for affordable housing. We would need to see the normalization of community-driven housing solutions. In terms of our more formal individual and collective changes, these are changes that are going to build an environment to actually support people and increase and improve any resources that allow social change to happen. So here we are looking at things like increased access to affordable housing for vulnerable populations and the creation of support infrastructure for people who are renting. In terms of our formal systemic changes, here we are looking at changes at the institutional level, so legislation and policy, that are going to try and address some of the root causes of the issue. So here we would want to see
strengthened regulations and protections for renters. And we would also want to see policy that's going to support an increased supply of affordable housing. We have our informal systemic change. So these are changes to kind of the broader ideas, practices, and conditions for individuals and communities who are affected by a specific issue. So here we would want to see a big kind of collective shift in our society towards housing being seen as a human right. And we would also want to see kind of long-term sustainability of affordable housing solutions. So what are some of the mechanisms, the things that we would need to do, the interventions that we would need in order to create some of these things? Well, one thing we could do to generate awareness and support for affordable housing. Another thing we might do is promote tenant-led forums and discussions in our community. In terms of normalizing community-driven housing solutions, one mechanism might be to promote more cooperative housing models in our community rather than relying solely on government-supported housing. And maybe here we would also want to see some support for local economies and developing local models of support. For our increased access to affordable housing for vulnerable populations, maybe something we would want to see here would be rent subsidy programs. We might want to see more first-time renter assistance. And perhaps we would even want to see more community housing projects. In terms of the creation of support infrastructures for renters, we would probably want to see more tenant advocacy services made available to people. Maybe we would want to see more rental market monitoring and reporting rather than just focusing on the housing market as a whole. And we could even have something like local housing advice centres where people are able to get support at the local level. In terms of our formal systemic changes and strengthening regulations and protections for renters, maybe here we would want to see stricter rent control legislation. Maybe here we would want to see mandatory inclusionary zoning and extended eviction moratorium. Some mechanisms that would help us to introduce policy to support an increased supply of affordable housing might be public and private partnerships, so formalizing some incentives to collaborate across sectors. And we would probably want to see a reform of negative gearing and capital gains tax. In terms of a shift towards housing as a human right, we would obviously want to see more of an influence from housing justice movements. We would probably want to see an integration of housing justice and discussions of this in our wider education system in terms of discussions of justice or housing. And we would probably want to see some community-led housing initiatives that kind of show us what this looks like at the grassroots level. In terms of the long-term sustainability of affordable housing solutions, we would need mechanisms like advocacy for sustainable urban development. Another mechanism could be the development of local housing trusts. And we would want to see more collaborative planning processes. That is going to enable us to have a longer term sustainability of affording housing solutions. So here we begin to see the different types of changes and some of the mechanisms that we would need to have in place to actually see those changes begin to manifest in our communities. So these are things that are going to help us to ensure that our interventions to address the housing crisis are targeting all of the different types of social change and some of those root causes of the housing crisis that we identified with our problem tree.
If you would like to learn more about systems thinking, what systems thinking is, and how you can apply it to social change challenges that you might be facing in your work as a change maker, then definitely check out my free training. It is the ultimate introduction to systems thinking. It is completely free and available at the School of Social Impact.